For a time, the conception of the world as a process of impersonal and invariable law soothed and sufficed him. But in the end, his essentially religious spirit turned this mute process into something almost lovable. He tried to merge his own desires with the universal order of things, to become an almost indistinguishable part of nature. The greatest good is the knowledge of the union which the mind has with the whole nature. Indeed, our individual separateness is in a sense illusory. We are parts of the great stream of law and cause, parts of God. We are the flitting forms of a being greater than ourselves and endless while we die. Our bodies are cells in the body of the race. Our race is an incident in the drama of life. Our minds are the fitful flashes of an eternal light. Our mind, insofar as it understands, is an eternal mode of thinking, which is determined by another mode of thinking, and this one again by another, and so on to infinity, so that they all constitute at the time the eternal and infinite intellect of God. In this pantheistic merging of the individual with the all, the Orient speaks again. We hear the echo of Omar, who never called the one two, and of the old Hindu poem, "Know in thyself and all one self-same soul, banish the dream that sunders part from whole." Sometimes, said Thoreau, as I drift idly on Walden Pond, I cease to live and begin to be. As such parts of such a whole, we are immortal. The human mind cannot be absolutely destroyed with the human body, but there is some part of it which remains eternal. This is the part that conceives things sub specie eternitatis. The more we so conceive things, the more eternal our thought is. Spinoza is even more than usually obscure here, and after endless controversy among interpreters, his language yet speaks differently to different minds. Sometimes one imagines him to mean George Eliot's immortality by repute, whereby that which is most rational and beautiful in our thought and our lives survives us to have an almost timeless efficacy down the years. Sometimes again, Spinoza seems to have in mind a personal and individual immortality. And it may be that as death loomed up so prematurely in his path, he yearned to console himself with this hope that springs eternal in the human breast. Yet he insistently differentiates eternity from everlastingness. If we pay attention to the common opinion of men, we shall see that they are conscious of the eternity of their minds, but they confuse eternity with duration, and attribute it to imagination or memory, which they believe will remain after death. But like Aristotle, Spinoza, though talking of immortality, denies the survival of personal memory. The mind can neither imagine nor recollect anything save while in the body. Nor does he believe in heavenly rewards. Those are far astray from a true estimate of virtue, who expect for their virtue, as if it were the greatest slavery, that God will adorn them with the greatest rewards, as if virtue and the serving of God were not happiness itself and the greatest liberty. Blessedness, reads the last proposition of Spinoza's book, is not the reward of virtue, but virtue itself. And perhaps in the like manner, immortality is not the reward of clear thinking, it is clear thought itself. As it carries up the past into the present and reaches out into the future, so overcoming the limits and narrowness of time, and catching the perspective that remains eternally behind the kaleidoscope of change. Such thought is immortal because every truth is permanent creation, part of the eternal acquisition of man, influencing him endlessly. Thus I have completed all I wish to show concerning the power of the mind over emotions, or the freedom of the mind, from which it is clear how much a wise man is in front of, and how stronger he is than an ignorant one, who is guided by lust alone. For an ignorant man, besides being agitated in many ways by external causes, never enjoys one true satisfaction of the mind. He lives, moreover, almost unconscious of himself, God, and things, and as soon as he ceases to be passive, ceases to be. On the contrary, the wise man, insofar as he is considered as such, is scarcely moved in spirit. He is conscious of himself, of God, and things by a certain eternal necessity. He never ceases to be, and always enjoys satisfaction of mind. All political philosophy, Spinoza thinks, must grow out of a distinction between the natural and the moral order. that is, between existence before and existence after the formation of organized societies. Spinoza supposes that men once lived in comparative isolation, without law or social organization. There were then, he says, no conceptions of right and wrong, justice or injustice. Might and right were one. Nothing can exist in a natural state which can be called good or bad by common assent, since every man who is in a natural state consults only his own advantage, and determines what is good or bad according to his own fancy, and insofar as he has regard for his own advantage alone, and holds himself responsible to no one save himself by any law. And therefore sin cannot be conceived in a natural state, but only in a civil state, where it is decreed by common consent what is good or bad, and each one holds himself responsible to the state. The law and ordinance of nature under which all men are born and for the most part live forbids nothing but what no one wishes or is able to do, and is not opposed to strife, hatred, anger, treachery, or in general anything that appetite suggests. We get an inkling of this law of nature, or this lawlessness of nature, by observing the behavior of states. There is no altruism among nations, for there can be law and morality only where there is an accepted organization, a common and recognized authority. The rights of states are now what the rights of individuals used to be, and still often are. That is, they are mights. And the leading states, by some forgetful honesty of diplomats, are very properly called the great powers. So it is too among species. There being no common organization, there is not among them any morality or law. Each species does to the other what it wishes and can. But among men, as mutual need begets mutual aid, this natural order of powers passes into a moral order of rights. Since fear of solitude exists in all men, because no one in solitude is strong enough to defend himself and procure the necessaries of life, it follows that men by nature tend towards social organization. To guard against danger, the force or strength of one man would hardly suffice if men did not arrange mutual aid and exchange. Men are not by nature, however, equipped for the mutual forbearance of social order, but danger begets association, which gradually nourishes and strengthens the social instincts. Men are not born for citizenship, but must be made fit for it. Most men are at heart individualistic rebels against law or custom. The social instincts are later and weaker than the individualistic, and need reinforcement. Man is not good by nature, as Rousseau was so disastrously to suppose. But through association, if even merely in the family, sympathy comes, a feeling of kind, and at last of kindness. We like what is like us. We pity not only a thing we have loved, but also one which we judge similar to ourselves. Out of this comes an imitation of emotions, and finally some degree of conscience. Conscience, however, is not innate, but acquired, and varies with geography. It is the deposit in the mind of the growing individual of the moral traditions of the group. Through it, society creates for itself an ally in the heart of its enemy, the naturally individualistic soul. Gradually, in this development, it comes about that the law of individual power, which obtains in a state of nature, yields in organized society to the legal and moral power of the whole. Might still remains right, but the might of the whole limits the might of the individual, limits it theoretically to his rights, to such exercise of his powers as agrees with the equal freedom of others. Part of the individual's natural might or sovereignty is handed over to the organized community in return for the enlargement of the sphere of his remaining powers. We abandon, for example, the right to fly from anger to violence, and are freed from the danger of such violence from others. Law is necessary because men are subject to passions. If all men were reasonable, law would be superfluous. The perfect law would bear to individuals the same relation which perfect reason bears to passions. It would be the coordination of conflicting forces to avoid the ruin and increase the power of the whole. Just as in metaphysics, reason is the perception of order in things, and in ethics, the establishment of order among desires, so in politics it is the establishment of order among men. The perfect state would limit the powers of its citizens only as far as these powers were mutually destructive. It would withdraw no liberty except to add a greater one. The last end of the state is not to dominate men, nor to restrain them by fear. Rather, it is so to free each man from fear, that he may live and act with full security, and without injury to himself or his neighbor. The end of the state, I repeat, is not to make rational beings into brute beasts and machines. It is to enable their bodies and their minds to function safely. It is to lead men to live by and to exercise a free reason, that they may not waste their strength in hatred, anger, and guile, nor act unfairly toward one another. Thus the end of the state is really liberty. Freedom is the goal of the state, because the function of the state is to promote growth, and growth depends on capacity finding freedom. But what if laws stifle growth and freedom? What shall a man do if the state, seeking, like every organism or organization, to preserve its own existence, which ordinarily means that office holders seek to keep themselves in office, becomes a mechanism of domineering and exploitation? Obey even the unjust law, answers Spinoza, if reasonable protest and discussions are allowed and speech is left free to secure a peaceful change. I confess that from such freedom inconveniences may sometimes arise, but what question was ever settled so wisely that no abuses could spring therefrom? Laws against free speech are subversive of all law, for men will not long respect laws which they may not criticize. The more a government strives to curtail freedom of speech, the more obstinately is it resisted, not indeed by the avaricious, but by those whom good education, sound morality, and virtue have rendered more free. Men in general are so constituted that there is nothing they will endure with so little patience as that views which they believe to be true should be counted crimes against the laws. Under such circumstances they do not think it disgraceful, but most honorable, to hold the laws in abhorrence, and to refrain from no action against the government. Laws which can be broken without any wrong to one's neighbor are counted but a laughing-stock, and so far from such laws restraining the appetites and lusts of mankind, they rather heighten them. Nitimur in vetitum semper, cupimusque negata. And Spinoza concludes, like a good American constitutionalist, if actions only could be made the ground of criminal prosecutions, and words were always allowed to pass free, sedition would be divested of every semblance of justification. The less control the state has over the mind, the better for both the citizen and the state. Spinoza, while recognizing the necessity of the state, distrusts it, knowing that power corrupts even the incorruptible. Was this not the name of Robespierre? And he does not look with equanimity upon the extension of its authority from the bodies and actions to the souls and thoughts of men. That would be the end of growth and the death of the group. So he disapproves of state control of education, especially in the universities. Academies that are founded at the public expense are instituted not so much to cultivate men's natural abilities as to restrain them. But in a free commonwealth, arts and sciences will be better cultivated to the full if everyone that asks leave is allowed to teach publicly, at his own cost and risk. His ideal apparently was higher education such as once flourished in Greece, coming not from institutions but from free individuals, sophists, who traveled from city to city and taught independently of either public or private control. These things premised, it makes no great difference what is the form of government, and Spinoza expresses only a mild preference for democracy. Any of the traditional political forms can be framed so that every man may prefer public right to private advantage. This is the task of the lawgiver. Monarchy is efficient, but oppressive and militaristic. Experience is thought to teach that it makes for peace and concord to confer the whole authority on one man. It has been the one song of those who thirst after absolute power that the interest of the state requires that its affairs should be conducted in secret. But the more such arguments disguise themselves under the mask of public welfare, the more oppressive is the slavery to which they will lead. Better that right counsels be known to enemies than that the evil secrets of tyrants should be concealed from the citizens. They who can treat secretly of the affairs of a nation have it absolutely under their authority, and as they plot against the enemy in time of war, so do they against the citizens in time of peace. Democracy is the most reasonable form of government, for in it Everyone submits to the control of authority over his actions, but not over his judgment and reason, i.e., seeing that all cannot think alike, the voice of the majority has the force of law. The military basis of this democracy should be universal military service, the citizens retaining their arms during peace. Its fiscal basis should be the single tax. The defect of democracy is its tendency to put mediocrity into power, and there is no way of avoiding this except by limiting office to men of trained skill. Numbers by themselves cannot produce wisdom, and may give the best favors of office to the grossest flatterers. The fickle disposition of the multitude almost reduces those who have experience of it to despair, for it is governed solely by emotions and not by reason. Thus, democratic government becomes a procession of brief-lived demagogues, and men of worth are loath to enter lists where they must be judged and rated by their inferiors. Sooner or later, the more capable men rebel against such a system, though they be in a minority. Hence, I think it is that democracies change into aristocracies, and those at length into monarchies. People at last prefer tyranny to chaos. Equality of power is an unstable condition. Men are by nature unequal, and he who seeks equality between unequals seeks an absurdity. Democracy has still to solve the problem of enlisting the best energies of men while giving to all alike the choice of those among the trained and fit by whom they wish to be ruled. Jacobi had brought Spinoza to the attention of Goethe. The great poet was converted, he tells us, at the first reading of the Ethics. It was precisely the philosophy for which his deepening soul had yearned. Henceforth it pervaded his poetry and his prose. It was here that he found the lesson, dass wir entsagen sollen, that we must accept the limitations which nature puts upon us. Coleridge filled his guests with Spinoza's table talk, and Wordsworth caught something of the philosopher's thought in his famous lines about something whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, and the round ocean, and the living air, and the blue sky, and in the mind of man, a motion and a spirit which impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. Perhaps so many were influenced by Spinoza because he lends himself to so many interpretations, and yields new riches at every reading. All profound utterances have varied facets for diverse minds. One may say of Spinoza what Ecclesiastes said of wisdom. The first man knew him not perfectly, no more shall the last find him out. For his thoughts are more deep than the sea, and his counsels profounder than the great deep. On the second centenary of Spinoza's death, subscriptions were collected for the erection of a statue to him at The Hague. Contributions came from every corner of the educated world. Never did a monument rise upon so wide a pedestal of love. At the unveiling in 1882, Ernest Renan concluded his address with words which may fitly conclude also our chapter. Woe to him who in passing should hurl an insult at this gentle and pensive head. He would be punished, as all vulgar souls are punished, by his very vulgarity, and by his incapacity to conceive what is divine. This man, from his granite pedestal, will point out to all men the way of blessedness which he found, and ages hence the cultivated traveler passing by this spot will say in his heart, the truest vision ever had of God came, perhaps, here.